Good afternoon. Obviously we've heard from the Democrats on their budget targets here. Obviously, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. They did talk about some things that we find concerning. Democrats want Minnesota to be #1 in higher taxes. Republicans want Minnesota to be #1 in job opportunities, and I think that's the biggest difference between Republicans and Democrats today. They also talked about creating more expensive government, and I think that the path that we're on right now of creating more efficient government that works for Minnesotans is the right path, and I think that that's playing out right now in our current budget. We obviously tackled a $6.2 billion deficit 2 years ago. When the governor was proposing at that time a 3% increase surcharge on the highest income earners, what he was doing was taxing job creators in Minnesota, and he realized when there was a $6.2 billion deficit in place that that was going to make Minnesota less competitive. And now what we have is the DFL legislature proposing basically the same thing. It was a bad idea then, and it's a bad idea now. It will make Minnesota less competitive, and it will mean less job opportunities for hardworking Minnesotans. I know Representative Kelby Woodard wants to talk a little bit about education. And Mary Liz can talk a little more about the budget targets, and then we can certainly take some questions. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. And just very briefly on the education budget, as we look at the overall target, a couple things that concern me. Of course, one is where's the reform? So we've had 30 years of the worst achievement gap in the nation, and to just double down on that and sprinkle a few dollars here and there within programs that haven't worked for 30 years, doesn't seem to be like a very smart investment to me. Secondarily, I would give them a little bit of credit here for a couple of fronts. One is that they do add, I think, $50 million into the early learning voucher system, which we actually proposed 2 years ago. And in fact, we proposed making that K through 12. And the governor thought it was a bad idea for K through 12, but likes it for early learning. So we think that's at least a start and a foundation for vouchers for all. And secondarily, I do commend them for going after the shift. I mean, certainly it's something that we committed to and the DFL committed to. Glad to see they're working on that. We would rather see them work on priorities and pay off that shift with existing resources and not burden our already overburdened Minnesota taxpayer. So we think there's certainly ways we can do that. We've provided some of those ideas to the DFL. Basically, a lot of those ideas were in our last plan that, one, the governor vetoed in 2011 and then finally signed later on in 2011. So there's lots of good ideas out there to use our existing resources rather than doubling down and making us the #1 tax state in the union.
My comments will be very brief. I would just caution that there is a lot more to the story that will take time to get the information. As we know, and we've tried to let you know, that within these net targets there can be all kinds of fee increases and additional spending within those targets. Now, 2 years ago when we did these targets, there was basically a prohibition on fee increases in our spending bill. So our numbers were pretty tight to what the end result will be. But if you look at the plethora of fee increases being proposed in bills that have been introduced this session, from paint to boats for invasive species, etc., a number of those fees would not show up in these budget targets, but they would definitely show up in the budgets of the average Minnesotan.
Questions?
Mr. Leader, the speaker took pains to say that as long as the business-to-business tax is kind of out of the mix, that the business community can probably live with. Again, what he was saying is they can probably live with this additional top bracket. What do you think about that?
Well, we had this discussion a couple of years ago when the governor proposed basically exactly the same thing. And as I said earlier, it was a bad idea then, it's a bad idea now. And frankly, it's going to make Minnesota less competitive. 92% of businesses in Minnesota file under the personal side of the income tax return. So what you're doing here is you're putting a tax on job creators in Minnesota, and frankly, you're making Minnesota an outlier, which is exactly what everybody has said we didn't want to do. And what we're doing here again is making Minnesota one of the highest tax states in the nation, and and frankly, we're at the cost of job opportunities for hardworking Minnesotans. So it's obviously the wrong move, and the governor pulled it off the table when we had a $6.2 billion deficit, and now we've got a $627 million deficit, 10 times less, and now we're proposing the same thing. You know, one of the interesting things that I heard Speaker Thiessen say when he was asked about what's the priority here, stability or revenue, he said revenue. I'm glad he's not hiding. You know, I think that, you know, we can see what the real motive here is. And we think it's the wrong move for Minnesota. Other questions?
Do you believe the income tax surcharge would be temporary?
Well, you know, there's an old saying that says there's nothing more permanent than a temporary tax, and obviously we all know that the last temporary tax was the half-cent sales tax in 1991, and we're still paying it. So I don't know what temporary exactly means, but you know, as the saying goes, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary tax.
So a lot of the Democrats are saying that this is needed because they need more money for schools, they need more money for property tax relief, those types of things, and they're saying, if you don't support tax increases, you don't support those types of investments or commitment. What's your response to that?
We balanced, as I've said, a $6.2 billion deficit over the last couple of years, and we actually made an increase in the K-12 formula of $650 million, I think, approximately. And we do have a commitment to K-12 education and making that investment. And I think there's other investments that can be made in higher education. But the problem is we're going to have the resources available to do that. You know, as Representative Woodard said, with our current resources, we should be able to accomplish that without a problem. And I'm not sure exactly how these proposals are going to work. We're going to ask a lot of questions in Ways and Means Committee tomorrow night. You know, what we showed over the last couple of years is that you can do all of this without the tax increases. And Minnesota's economy is headed in the right direction. Unemployment was 7% 2 years ago, 5.5% today. We actually have seen surplus revenues of about $3 billion in the current biennium. So, you know, we don't need to increase taxes to accomplish what we need to in Minnesota as far as balancing the budget.
To what extent do you expect to spend caucus funds to kind of wage a PR battle on this with the general public versus having independent groups do it?
You know, a good question. I don't. You know, we haven't talked about that, and obviously we're eager to have a discussion about this. We think that our plan that we've put in place over the last couple of years is working for Minnesota's economy. We think it's the right move, and frankly, we know that the public understands that tax increases will harm Minnesota's economy, and you know, recent polling numbers have shown that, and the governor has pulled some of his tax increases off of the table. So, you know, we think Minnesotans get it, and we're eager to have that conversation. You know, as far as spending resources, I don't know, but
Your opposition to the tax increase on high earners plays well in your districts?
You know, I'm confident that Minnesotans understand that when you increase taxes, it's bad for Minnesota's economy, and making Minnesota an outlier in the income tax area is basically making Minnesota less competitive. And as I said, 92% of 92% of Minnesota businesses file under the personal side of the income tax. So that's what you're doing. And when we tax a business, they pass that tax and that cost along to their customers. And what that means is higher costs for goods and services in Minnesota. And that's the wrong direction for the economy.
Give us a few substantial cuts that you think could be made that would make up for some of this revenue that they want.
You know, I think that probably more importantly, we should talk about finding efficiencies, and you know, one of the ones I mentioned early on was the PCR program that's set to come back. That's basically welfare for politicians. I mean, there's sure, but I think if we can find enough of those things, we can certainly handle this problem without too much trouble. I mean, we did this with $6.2 billion 2 years ago, and you know, without getting into too much specifics, we look forward to rolling up our sleeves and working with the Democrats and help find these efficiencies. That's what our committees should be working on today. You know, I know that the DFL continues to talk about making investments in higher education, and one of the arguments that I've made on that is we need to have jobs for people when they get their degrees. And if we don't have jobs for people, what we're going to be doing is educating our workforce for Wisconsin and North and South Dakota. And the priorities are messed up. The Higher Ed Committee in the House hasn't heard one bill yet. not one bill. If that's their priority, put your money where your mouth is and take action. But we haven't seen that yet. So, other questions?
We have a budget.
I said this last Friday. And I would be disingenuous if I said that, we didn't want to work with them. We really do, and I want to give them the opportunity to work with us. We're going to start that process, obviously, tomorrow night in the Ways and Means Committee. That will start a discussion, and I hope that we can come up with a final solution that can have bipartisan support. I really do, and I would be disingenuous if today I was standing here saying we absolutely can't work with the DFL, and we're going to come with our own budget. So we hope that we can work with them and come up with something together. And we hope this is just a starting place, because we think that based on these proposals, it's the wrong direction for Minnesota.
You talk about coming up with a bipartisan solution. So if you came up with something that was half cuts and half new tax revenue, could you live with that? Would that be a bipartisan compromise?
Well, and I continue to tell the story about what we accomplished over the last 2 years. The governor called our budget an all-cuts budget. And today, he and the DFL are proposing an all-tax budget. We actually, created more revenue, and will see more revenue to the state in our all-cuts budget than they will in their all-tax budget. So the discussion doesn't really need to be about that. The governor has proposed or said over the last 2 years that he wants a balanced approach. But we learned what his balanced approach was, is increasing taxes. It's $17 of tax increases. I don't know what the latest numbers are now, but initially it was $17 of tax increases for every dollar in cuts. That's not a balanced approach, and we need to stop letting politicians say one thing and then do another. And the governor agrees with me that we need to, number one, make sure that Minnesota stays competitive. But the problem is these proposals make Minnesota less competitive, and I think that people understand that.
I apologize for interrupting. Mr. Leader, you're suggesting you want to pay back the shift and also raise the deficit, which is roughly $1.4 billion. And the cut that you're putting forward is a $10 million PCR cut. You don't have any other big ticket items besides that?
We can get some more.
I mean, you're suggesting this can be done, but even in your last budget, you had to use one-time money and rely on the K-12 school shift. So where can you do it?
Well, and we'll obviously, we can come up with some proposals through the process here, but obviously we want to work with the DFL to do this, and that's what we do here in the legislature and the committee process is work together on that. You want to speak on that? Sure.
One of my frustrations, maybe some of you remember 2 years ago, in a step past this where we actually put out our budget bills and started working the numbers, the governor used to tell us that we had funny money in our bills, that these reforms would not net the savings that we were booking for various reforms in those bills. And less than 2 years later, as the budget forecasts kept getting better and better, and spending levels in various areas of state government were holding flat or not growing as fast, he also took credit for the reforms in state government that resulted in these lower levels of spending. And so I think that, it's a combination of a lot of factors, but if you look at where we were 2 years ago, the increased revenue coming from just growth in the economy, the fact that our unemployment rate is lower than the national average, that we see growth in the number of jobs outpacing as a percentage what national averages are, I don't think we're doing too bad on a plan in which we respected the checkbook of the average hardworking Minnesota. You talk about the surcharge on the upper income. That's one element for our job creators, but when you pile on minimum wage increases, other proposals, the cumulative effect of all of those changes on the viability of our businesses is really striking. And when you look at our neighbors that are taking advantage of economic growth opportunities in the energy sector, it looks like we're going to put a moratorium on that sector in our state for a couple years. I mean, all these things have a cumulative effect. And so it's easy to pull out one element or the other, but I think you have to look at the whole picture here, and it's two very stark differences in the way we would approach solving the challenges in the state of Minnesota.
Mr. Leader, this proposal, I'm talking about the additional bracket or whatever you want to call it, in conjunction with the fourth bracket that is probably going to pass this legislature. Does this usher Republicans back into a majority in the Minnesota House in 2014?
Well, it's an interesting, that isn't what this is about. What we want to do is what's good for Minnesota. We want to keep Minnesota competitive.
I understand that, but is that the political ramification of it? Because that's where the rubber meets the road.
Ultimately, it's up to the voters of Minnesota, and they ultimately will make that decision. And there's going to be a referendum on all of these policies in the next election. And I'll tell you that I'm eager to have this conversation with Minnesotans because the plan that we've put in place over the last couple of years has worked. It is working. Minnesota's economy is headed in the right direction, and we think that Minnesotans understand that. So I'm very eager to have that conversation.
You need to get back to me.
Okay. Thank you.